movement has achieved and the work that we still have ahead of us. Thinking about this, I want to ground us in the fact that we are still speaking in a moment of ongoing genocide, and the fact that genocide that has accelerated, and that we are watching the attempted mass extermination of people, that we have in fact watched the Zionist entity attack state after state after state, kill civilians in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, that it has gone completely rogue. And we are, well, it's always been rogue, but so I'm excited for today's conversation with three folks who represent three important segments of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I'm going to be moderating this conversation and also maybe throwing in a thought or two because I can't help myself. I'm just pulling up so yeah, the way that today will proceed is I'm going to sort of just introducing the conversation. And first, actually, we're going to hear from, before we start our conversation with these three panelists, we're also going to hear from two of the folks who recently went on hunger strike for Gaza with Jewish Voice for Peace Chicago. So let me first introduce our speakers. So we have Olivia Katbi, who is the North America coordinator for the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign. We have Nashwa from the Palestinian Youth Movement, and we have Sahar from National SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. To sort of introduce myself, I organize with faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine at the University of Chicago, Scholars for Social Justice, and a local collective called Silver Collective. Before we start our conversation, I'm going to invite Becca and Seth, who just ended a 19-day hunger strike.
Thank you so much for having us here. As Eman mentioned, we engaged in a hunger strike that went for a total of 18 days. I was tapped out by the medical team on day 8. Becca went for the whole 18 days, so I've had a lot longer to recover, so I'm going to stay for this whole panel, but I think Becca's going to head out right after this. Something that we have, that's come up a lot in our internal conversations in JVP Chicago, particularly I'm thinking of when we were deciding to participate in the DNC protests, not knowing the level of risk and police violence we were going to encounter, was thinking about ourselves as historical subjects and thinking about ourselves as ancestors. And to me personally, it's really important to know that there are people in the future who will be able to look back and say that there were Americans and that there were Jews who did everything they possibly could to stop the genocide in its tracks. So that's something that I've been holding. In terms of our experience over the course of the strike, we had an enormous groundswell of love and care and support, locally and nationally and internationally. That was really amazing to see, and I think it underlined the fact that our movement is very strong and growing. And I think the question for me that I hope to learn from the wisdom of the folks here is like, how do we translate that huge, important, growing power on the level of popular political consciousness into political power? Because I want to win. So yeah, thanks so much for having us here.
Thank you all for having me here. Bear with me if this is a little rough. I struggled with what to say to this room because the Chicago movement is so incredible. And I don't feel like I have many answers about what is the future of the movement. We chose to take on this hunger strike not because we knew for sure what kind of impact it would have, but because we really just felt like we had to try something. we say genocide over and over, and sometimes I worry that it is losing its meaning for people, that people are hearing it, and even people who are like, yes, there's a genocide, yes, it's bad, or going numb, are not feeling the weight of every individual human person that we lose every single day that we fail to stop this. And I think this tactic was an attempt to break through the numbness, to remind people that what's happening isn't distant. If what that takes for some people is bringing an experience of hunger and that visceral reminder to someone that they know or someone in their own city or community, hopefully that would matter. I think I also wanted to take on this tactic as a rejection of the hierarchy of human life that just is the structure of this country and world, where Jewish lives have more value than Palestinian lives, and American lives are valued more than anyone else, and the ways that that is what dictates our foreign policy and domestic policy. I think we were doing this as a rejection of the idea that our bodies are somehow more important than anyone else's, and as a way of trying to physically express solidarity. I thought that doing this strike would make me feel closer to the experiences of people in Gaza, and instead it just every single day reminded me how deeply our positions, nothing we did was in any way comparable to a fraction of what anyone in Gaza is going through. We were surrounded by a care team and people who loved and cared for us, and doctors and air conditioning. I cannot imagine doing this in the summer heat in Palestine. We were not caring for any children who were also starving. We were not making choices about risking our lives or feeding our families. And we got to choose this, and we knew when it would end. I'm still feeling and processing the heaviness of that, but I hope that one part of what's next for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement is that we don't allow ourselves to become numb to what's happening, even though it is hard not to. And I hope that we keep trying things, because we're not going to know what works until it works. And so I hope we keep experimenting with the conviction that just trying something is better than giving up or doing nothing or freezing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you both. I know that the hunger strike brought energy here in Chicago, and we have many events around it, and I think it was a shot in the arm for many folks, so I appreciate you. And I wish you a speedy recovery, and yeah, we love you. So in that spirit of reflection and thinking about what has worked and what has not worked, yesterday we had a session about Eman Abdelhadi, and one of his political lessons is the need to constantly reflect on our movement spaces, on our political struggles, to constantly be in assessment and re-strategizing. So that's our goal here today. I'm going to turn it to our panelists, and the question that I asked them to reflect on is thinking about your own work and the work of your sort of sector of the movement. What do you think has worked so far, and where do you think we need to go next? So I'll turn it over to Olivia first.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to be speaking both in my capacity as the North American coordinator for the BDS movement and also as co-chair of the Portland chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. And I want to clarify that those are different roles, so my views around DSA are not necessarily reflective of the BDS movement, which is a massive global movement led by the largest coalition of Palestinian civil society. And my colleagues in the BDS movement are sometimes like, Olivia, you know, DSA isn't the only thing happening in the US, like, you gotta do other stuff too. We're at Socialism Conference, so I'm gonna talk about the socialist organizing as well. I appreciate that we're starting this discussion off with a question about like what has worked and what we have won, because it is very hard to feel like, you know, we're winning anything when we have seen day after day of massacre for almost 2 years. But we are winning things. So first, wearing my BDS hat, July, this month, is actually the 20th anniversary of the founding of BDS. And I say that to say, yeah, it's great, and ultimately we want to organize our movement out of existence because we don't want to have to have it in the first place. But I say that to say that none of the wins we have seen in the past 2 years happen in a vacuum. They happen because of 20 years of laying the groundwork and building strategic campaigns and coalitions and doing very thorough research and doing that diligently in the face of so much repression and propaganda and money. The BDS movement has maintained incredible discipline and focus and continued to build this massive global movement. Over the years, we've seen major pension funds divest billions of dollars from Israel. We've seen major global corporations withdraw from Israel completely following BDS pressure. I hope that our comrades will talk about the recent MERS victory and building on that. And now we're finally getting to the S in BDS, which is sanctions. And you know, the primary sanction that we are calling for right now is a military embargo. And I think a common misconception when people think about BDS is they think about individual consumer boycotts, and like, what am I personally going to boycott? And while that's certainly a part of it, BDS is about collective action, meaning organizing a mass movement around a specific target to win a campaign, to move money and support out of Israel, to isolate Israel politically and economically. So, you know, people will sometimes say, well, BDS doesn't go far enough, we need to go after the weapons companies. That is BDS. The primary demand right now is the military embargo, and the B and the D are tools we use to help us get to that S. And we have seen over 52 countries either call for or implement some form of military embargo since the genocide began. And the organized workers in these countries are the ones holding their leaders' feet to the fire on this. Dock workers in so many countries now have been refusing to load weapons to Israel. Workers in Norway and the UK have successfully been pushing massive pension funds to divest. And these workers are often working in lockstep with left political parties. Which brings me to the US. In the US, we have had some major corporate victories over the years, including some of the campaigns that I've worked on. G4S, which is a massive global security company, General Mills, Ben & Jerry's, Puma. Victories meaning, you know, these companies stopped doing business in Israel as a result of BDS campaigns. US churches and some pension funds have divested from complicit companies and from Israel bonds. Since 2024, we have had at least 7 cities and counties divest from complicit corporations and Israel bonds, including Alameda, Portland, Maine, Hayward, California. And a majority of the entire US population across party lines now supports an arms embargo on Israel. And that is a massive shift in popular opinion. But popular opinion has not lined up with what is happening in the halls of power. The US is the main provider of weapons and funding for Israel's genocide, and in the US we are far behind other countries in terms of institutional support for BDS with our elected leaders, with our trade unions. There are not going to be workers in the US right now who are ready to stop loading weapons to Israel. And so that brings me to kind of switch hats to my DSA hat. And you know, the title of this panel is What's Next? And to me, what's next is DSA. DSA is the largest socialist organization in the United States, and it is the through line. I don't think we can work in issue-based silos on Palestine over here, and climate over here, and labor over here. Socialism unites all of this under one banner. And obviously everyone is paying attention to our comrade Zoran Mamdani right now, who won the New York City mayoral primary. Zoran joined DSA because of our stance on BDS. He said that himself in 2020. And I think he has shown that this combination of having the background of those principles, plus strategic coalition building, plus on-the-ground socialist organizing is a winning campaign. In Portland, Oregon, we have 4 DSA members on city council. That's a third of the council, of 12 councilors total. And these are not just mushy progressives who, DSA decided to add to our voter pamphlet. That is not how our DSA chapter operates. These are cadre members who are unflinching socialists and unwavering in their stance in support of Palestine. And they are able to do that because of the work that DSA has done in Portland over the last near decade now. I joined in 2016. We have won some major BDS campaigns. We got our NBA team to cut ties with a sniper scope manufacturer that was providing scopes to the IDF that had a weird sponsorship after a very public campaign. We contributed to Intel, which is headquartered outside of Portland, canceling its plans for a $25 billion expansion in Israel. Our chapter's committed BDS work, coupled with our deep organizing in all other areas of the socialist movement. We won universal preschool for the entire county, paid for by taxing the rich. Many of our members have organized unions and won union elections and now are in leadership of their unions. We had a ballot measure campaign for eviction protections. Because we work on all of these issues together, along with Palestine as a priority, we have created a situation in Portland where it is not an option to consider yourself a progressive if you do not support Palestine. And we've created the situation that DSA in Portland sets the standard for what is considered progressive. If you're running for office, you're not going to get endorsements, not only from us, but from all the other progressive organizations that work on a variety of issues, if you're not supporting Palestine, because they know that if you're willing to cave on that issue, there's no reason why anyone should believe that you will fight for them on any other issue. And so what this looks like in practice, and we'll wrap up here, with our socialists in office now who have been in City Hall for about 5 months, we got a Chevron sponsorship. Chevron is a big BDS target. We got a Chevron sponsorship dropped from a councilor forum hosted by the City Club. Our DSA councilors just said they weren't going to show up if they didn't drop the sponsorship, and so they did. And that was something that climate groups had been asking for years, and they were ignored. Councilor Mitch Green, who's chief of staff this year, he also threatened to vote against city funding for a new building for Portland State University unless PSU dropped disciplinary charges against the students that had been in the campus. And they did, they dropped the charges. And we didn't have to ask Mitch to do that, he just knew to do it because he came out of our chapter, he was our treasurer. He literally just texted me one day and was like, hey, there was this Chevron sponsorship, but we're organizing around it, and I think we're going to get it dropped, and we're going to put out a statement. Like, they just did their own BDS campaign and told us about it later. I think that just shows, how they act as a bloc, as DSA, because they came from our chapter. And now we're gearing up for our investment policy vote, which is going to be in December. So, it shows what happens when we elect our cadre members who are taking DSA into office with them. And I think that's how we're going to actually be able to change policy around the country. If we want more Zorans and more Mitches, we not only have to run people for office, but we have to build a party-like organization that does all of this deep organizing, which has been the base and the movement that is in office with these electeds, and bringing along labor, and all of the parents who organize for universal preschool, and all of the renters who are doing our Renters Bill of Rights campaign, and all of the broader communities that we are embedded into. That is what it means to be a party-like organization, and I think that is what we need to win.
Thank you so much. I think that was really brilliant. So the first thing that I think, in order to have a comprehensive assessment of our movement nationally over the last 20 months, I think it's important to first ground ourselves in what our role is here, right? So I think the first thing to talk about is confronting Zionism. So we live in a country that is the main benefactor of Israel, and which has been the main facilitator of its genocide for almost 2 years now. And I won't talk about the billions of US tax dollars that get sent every year to Israel, the billions of dollars that has since been sent there since the start of the genocide, the weapons contracts that the US has, the close relationship between Israel and the US. I think that these are are all things that we are by this point, very intimately familiar with. So what I'll say instead is this: as people of conscience who live in this country, our role first and foremost is to build our power so that we can put a wrench in US imperialism in whatever way we can. Because if it wasn't clear to people before, it should be very clear to everyone now that Israel doesn't have the capability to be in a war of attrition with Gaza without the United States. And whenever we put a wrench in that, we do the same thing to Zionism. So we have a critical role to play, not only in that, but also in raising popular consciousness, especially on resistance and to internationalize the popular cradle. So now that we're kind of grounded in what our role is here, I wanted to take us through what we've won and what has been effective in our movement so far, which I know feels maybe surreal to talk about since we're 20 months into a genocide that hasn't stopped yet. I know that we're in this phase of the genocide where aid and food has largely been halted from entering Gaza for about 5 months now. So now Palestinians aren't just dying from Israel's bombs, but the lack of starvation or because of lack of food and also lack of aid too. And on top of that, we are seeing all this suffering happening on our phones. And I think that what this ends up doing is it's a recipe for demoralization, for hopelessness and defeatism. And these are what make us feel like the work that we have been doing for the past 2 years was all for nothing. That because we didn't stop the genocide with our bare hands, that everything we've done for the past 20 months was meaningless. But the reality is that if there were a set of tactics we could have done in these 20 months to end the genocide, then our movement would have done them. And the reality is that this is a long-term struggle, which means that we need to be building the capabilities and the capacity to stay in the struggle long-term, not just until there's a ceasefire in Gaza, but until Palestine is liberated, meaning until there's no longer a siege on Gaza, until the West Bank is no longer divided by checkpoints and walls, until there's no settlers occupying our land, and until the occupation itself is defeated, and until all Palestinians displaced since the Nakba can return. So with that being said, I wanted to take us back in time about 20 months ago and take us through some of the most important gains of our movement. So if you go back to October 2023, I think one of our biggest initial successes as a movement was our intervention in the dominant media narrative. I'm sure a lot of you remember that moment. I think if you recall, the dominant narrative was obviously not on our side following October 7th, right? We understood pretty quickly that Palestinians and the Palestinian movement was going to be villainized, was going to be scapegoated in order to manufacture consent for what eventually became Gaza's genocide. And the PYM in particular immediately began disseminating media trainings and talking points and started to make strong interventions in the dominant narrative in order to combat this attempt and to raise the popular consciousness of people around this issue. And I think the stronger parts of our movement moved in a similar way. And so now Israel's genocide in Gaza is totally unpopular, not just around the world, but here in this country that is the main facilitator of it. So the majority of Americans, I think it's something like 55% now, disapprove of what Israel's doing in Gaza and disapprove of the American involvement in it. And not only that, but recent global surveys are finding that the majority of countries around the world have a negative view of Israel. And not only that, but if you look at the way, even the way the media has largely shifted, even the way right-wing media has shifted has also been something that has been happening since October of 2023. I think something else that's a part of this narrative intervention is our movement was able to move politics on the left. I think we take that for granted now because there's this conference happening where there's been so many panels that have to do with Palestine. But there was a time in the left, believe it or not, where that wasn't the case, where Palestine was either seen as a non-issue or as seen as something marginal, and not as something that could politicize people or that was important to the left at all. And so I think that's another important win. And I also wanted to say that I think a big win for our movement is that we made sure that the Palestinian movement was not co-optable. And I think that was another win. I also kind of wanted to talk about how we were able to build coordination and collective power in this moment in a way that I think is really unprecedented. Again, going back to October 2023, there was the National March for Palestine on November 4th, I believe. and the formation of the Shutting Down Coalition, which coordinated days of actions that were mass. The bar was lowered so that anyone could participate in it. And nationally, that coalition helped our movement build power, and then the relationships that we built through it helped us launch the People's Conference for Palestine, which was a huge moment for convening the movement, driving what came after that, and also another important moment for narrative intervention and consensus building. And speaking of which, I also wanted to plug the second annual People's Conference for Palestine. It's happening in Detroit on August 21st. And I just wanted to say, I think it's going to be an especially important time for our movement to convene and talk about what's next. Whether there's a ceasefire or not, we are still going to have work to do, so I hope to see everyone there. But I did want to say that the reason this conference is an important point in our movement over the past 2 years, and was important in general, was because it was a Palestinian-led conference that convened the movement and was rooted in our vision for our national liberation struggle. And I think maybe those of us in the movement now, especially those of us who are younger, we might take for granted how the Oslo Accords disseminated our movement, and since then our movement has mainly been dominated by and led by the solidarity movement. And that's not a judgment on that at all. I think every person has a role to play in our movement, but all national liberation struggles are led by the people who are pressed to have a vision for their own future. And I think it was a very important intervention for us to have that sort of convening that was able to become the reference point for that moment of the genocide. And then I think something else that I wanted to talk a little bit about was the Mass Commerce campaign. I think that obviously, how many people here have heard about the Mass Commerce campaign? Okay, amazing. So this was a campaign that was launched a little over a year ago at the People's Conference, and it was something that was important for a lot of reasons. We really recently just saw some really big wins. One of them being that that Maersk stopped shipments to the port of Haifa, which is like one of I think 2 operating ports right now in Israel, and it's a big deal. But I think the reason why the Mass Commerce campaign is really important is because it raised the ceiling of what our movement can accomplish. I think that our movement has sort of been at this point where sorry, there's a lot of flies here, but I think our movement has been at this sort of juncture right now where we are feeling a lot of that defeatism, where we're feeling like the past 2 years have been for nothing because, like I said, we did stop the genocide with our bare hands, when in reality there are these gains and these accomplishments that have been made, and we still have work to do beyond that. What the Mass Commerce campaign was able to do was raise that ceiling, and it was a creative way of raising that ceiling of what our movement can do. And I think that it's our duty to be creative and raise the ceiling of what's possible. And I think that we have widened the Palestine movement over the past 20 months because the genocide has heightened consciousness, and it's our duty to use that momentum from the past 2 years to figure out these types of campaigns like People's Arms Embargo that can make gains and huge wins in 1 year, and that are able to raise the ceiling of what our movement can accomplish beyond what we've been seeing in our movement for the past 20 years, which have also been huge accomplishments, but we can do more and we should do more. So that's kind of, I guess I'll end off with saying that. I think that, I don't think that there's anyone in this room, I don't think there's anyone in the Palestine movement who hasn't sacrificed major parts of their life, and who has done the work to do everything they can to stop this genocide. And I just want to say that I think that whenever we're in these panels and we're making these assessments, I hope that you all are asking yourself these types of questions too. What were the things that we wish we could have been prepared for prior to October 7th? And how are we learning to prepare for the future of our movement too, whenever we're making these assessments? And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nashwa. That was very powerful and very interesting, and kind of building off of what you were saying. As a student, and speaking as a member of NSJP, I think in order to understand what has been effective for the student movement so far, it's important to understand the role of the students specifically. So I kind of see this in 2 ways. First, one of the most important roles is for the student to raise the political consciousness of other students on campus in order to form a anti-imperial front. So this looks like creating a base of politicized students, organizing them into SJPs and other political groups, and then mobilizing them around direct demands that are targeted at the university. So we saw this during the encampments through the demands to disclose, divest, and boycott. And by doing this, students are able to destabilize the neoliberal structure of the university in order to disrupt its role in the US empire and further its role in the occupation and genocide of Palestine. I think another major role also is to propagate anti-imperial politics amongst the masses. So this can mean organizing in solidarity with workers in the community by using the campus kind of as a battleground that can heighten contradictions. So this can be used both on and off campus as well. So on campus, this can look like, propagating this among staff and faculty through your student organizing. So I think in the process of the student intifada, students who have been fighting for Palestinian liberation have correctly identified and taken up these roles. And so when you think about like what has been effective for the student movement, really it comes down to sustained and escalated disruption on campus with clear goals and clear demands. So something that students have been doing well is the concept of power mapping. So like understanding the distribution of power within the university and targeting it at multiple levels. Especially now with students understanding more and more that the board of trustees at universities represents the presence and the oversight of the ruling class in the university with direct say in its operations and direct say in how money is being invested that further goes on to propagate genocide. I think also more broadly, like understanding the position of the university in the imperial superstructure as well. So some ways that they've done this is by engaging in rallies, engaging in sit-ins, walkouts, occupations, and encampments. And this has been effective, first because it stops business as usual and forces the focus onto the university's role in the genocide in Palestine. And also, very importantly, it directly contradicts the pacifying nature of the university, which basically aims to, churn out this workforce, this managerial workforce that can then work for the empire and reproduce class relationships. And by politicizing students around Palestine, around anti-imperialism, it provides an existential threat to the ruling class and to the function of empire by basically destabilizing their training grounds. So in the more effective use of more effective scenarios of student organizing on campuses, we've seen the use of the concept of the escalation ladder, right? So the idea that if we consider repression and resistance to be this kind of dialectical relationship, then following each uptick in disruption, following each uptick in repression, there's an uptick in disruption, there's this response, right? And building up that kind of gradual student support within that kind of idea. So an example of this, to kind of put it into more specific terms, is we saw that students were passing divestment resolutions through their student government to divest. And so this resulted in order for these to be passed, there had to be majority support. So a lot of students had to be kind of mobilized around this in order to put it through. Students maybe saw no response to the university administration or empty promises. And this is something that you then can propagandize around as an SJP and bring this kind of awareness that results in the next step that you can take. So with that level of mobilization, what can you do next, right? Maybe that's a sit-in, for example. And so these kinds of gradual build-ups were able to kind of work towards achieving specific goals that the students had, destabilizing the university structure and resulting in specific kinds of material harm to the university itself. And something especially recently to consider in regards to the repression that we've kind of been seeing on the student front of the movement is that often it's we're working towards, in many cases, divestment was the demand. But in working towards this divestment, there is also like a larger goal to be achieved in how we are making students think about the university. So kind of mentioning previously, like the corporate structure of the university, the idea that these board of trustees have so much power that they're using to fund genocide, and thinking about alternatives to that, right? So this is kind of where, like, if the repression comes in, that is something that students can now like even work with in a sense to kind of turn that around and advocate around that. So in the most effective scenarios, we've seen students kind of like pick up on that and navigate that and use that to politicize students around Gaza, around anti-imperialism, and so on and so forth. And I just want to mention that because I think that that's something that people sometimes outside the student context can kind of understand as adventurism on behalf of the student movement. And I think it kind of misrepresents the kind of way that students are kind of viewing the university in the current moment and how they are choosing to respond to that like change in understanding of its function. But moving on to like what we've won so far, I think it's really important that first of all, we've helped kind of further expose Zionism as a settler colonial white supremacist ideology that's integral in maintaining imperialism around the globe, right? Further bringing kind of that popular attention to the struggle for Palestinian liberation in the Imperial War. Encampments were an example of this. Students were putting up tents to reflect the displacement of people in Rafah at the time who were living in tents themselves and kind of disrupting business as usual to bring attention to that. Another important thing is the kind of re-politicization of campuses following crackdowns in the 60s and 70s. So when we talk about, you know, the movement against the Vietnam War, when we talk about apartheid, you know, following this, there was like incredible democratic backsliding that resulted in things like, you know, committees and task forces and student governments being manipulated and presented as these avenues for change within the university structure, which we know can only be utilized so far and do not function to actually disrupt the structure more largely. But repoliticizing, using Palestine, thinking about Palestine and bringing that to the forefront, Palestine has helped us repoliticize the university in that way. And also heightening contradictions between the state and the masses in respect to imperialism. So we've talked about the connection between the US and the Zionist entity for sure. Also the concept that we're seeing recently of the imperial boomerang, you know, like the idea that these repressive techniques that are employed by the US in like settler colonies like Palestine will come back and will also be witnessed in the imperial war. So we can see this through deadly exchange and the training of police forces by the IOF, who are then using those tactics on students at encampments and recently ice raids as well. So kind of bringing awareness to that. Heightening contradictions, like I mentioned, between the student and the university, now thinking of the idea of like abolishing the board of trustees specifically and democratizing the institution and bringing control of the university, power over education into popular hands. And also, you know, achieving disclosure and divestment in specific cases, which, you know, kind of showed how the university operates as a corporation. And I just want to reiterate, like this, because of the stage that we are at in the genocide and how heightened it is really easy to feel like we haven't done anything. But I think even if these gains seem kind of broad, it's important to highlight them because these are like stepping stones that we work off of in order to continue fighting for Palestinian liberation on campus. And also it's important to, you know, new students who are coming in, new people who are coming in, for them to know about these things so they can build on it. And so I'll finish off, but in terms of what's next, the first thing is, of course, maintaining and attacking all fronts towards the state's role in the genocide. So continuing to highlight Palestine by using the campus to disrupt that manufacturing of like liberal ideology that's used to justify occupation and genocide, rejecting any and all attempts at normalization or depoliticization on campus, training students and making sure that information and experience is being passed on so that they can continue the struggle and maintain constant pressure. And then another thing is, and this is something that, like, for example, this happened because of the focus on Gaza and because of the focus on Palestine, but also something we like have to thank the people of Gaza for and thank Palestine for, because it operated in like both ways, in the sense that students established these encampments to bring attention to what's happening in Gaza, but at the same time, that process brought the idea of the popular university to us. So the idea that we can imagine a future for education, for popular education, that is from the people to the people, that doesn't operate through this structure of the university. And then lastly and most importantly, this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest element of the student movement, which is making sure Gaza is not forgotten. You know, centering it and keeping it in the public eye, constantly making sure that every avenue of the community, every avenue of society, everyone is talking about Palestine, everyone is talking about Gaza until it is inevitably liberated. So that's kind of what I had, and yeah, I'll end up.
Thank you so much to all three of you and to the movements that you represent. So it's very inspiring to hear all of you speak about these both material and ideological wins. And I want to give people a heads up that I was like, I'm gonna respond and ask you questions. So this part is rather unscripted. So feel free to, if you don't want to answer my question, just be like, I'm gonna talk about something else. Which, only because we're not in my class. If we were in my class, it would be a different story. So I wanna first, so we talked a lot about both material and ideological wins, right? That have happened, and consciousness raising as a theme that's something that our movement has done really well. We've also sort of hit we've hit a wall. Yeah, I think we have to be sort of honest with ourselves that our direct actions are smaller and less frequent. The state has gotten particularly good at absorbing the costs. The state and the university have gotten very good at absorbing the costs of direct action. So, whereas people out there in the world could block a highway theoretically, for a couple hours, like 2 years ago, now it lasts 5 minutes if it even happens. The state has also, and we think we've seen this even more so in the context of repression, in the context of the university. Sorry, this is panel 4 for me, so what is language, who are we, what are we doing here? In the context of the university, we've seen an enormous, repressive backlash, and one that much of the liberal core of the institution actually has very little to say about or to resist, right? So I guess this my first question I'll direct to Nashwa and to Sahar. Is it Sahar or Sahar? Sahar, okay, great. I just don't want to Arabify somebody's name. So my question is, how do we manage this wall? Do we need a pivot, right? I think, some would say, it seemed like PYM, for example, was doing a lot of direct action and then maybe pivoted to the mask off Merce campaign, a campaign strategy. On campuses, we've seen a huge fluctuation in the ability to fight on all fronts, right, to show up. How do we manage this moment? Do we need a pivot? What does it look like? Would be my broad question to the two of you, and then Olivia, I'll ask you a question next.
Sure, yeah, that's a really good question. It kind of is like the question of the hour, I think. When it comes to this, to put it plainly, I think it's time to get creative. We've seen this with, I'll speak specifically in the context of the student movement when it comes to Palestine, but we've seen it with, previously there was GUFS, and like the idea that you could be in a place where you've built out this, you've built out these structures, you've built out these SJPs, you've built out these chapters, and on paper, it looks like you have that structure there, and that you are, like, despite the repression, in a place where you can continue, but really what it comes down to is the only way that a political movement, specifically in the context of students, with that high turnover that we face, can survive is if we move past stagnation. So like the idea of trying the same things over and over and over again, we know encampments worked at a specific time, in a specific political moment, because of the context of that moment and because of the like specificities of the tactic and also the novelty of the tactic to an extent. And now at this point, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, right? So it's kind of a thing of like, we have gotten to this point where in order for us to survive, in order for us to move on, we have to look at what we've learned, we have to look at our analyses, and we have to understand, okay, how do we step this up a notch? And I can't very clearly say this is exactly how we step it up a notch. I think we're all like in that point right now where we're trying to figure that out collectively. But I will say that, there is like specific problems to within the student movement. So like what I mentioned is that like turnover, like students will come in, fourth year, fifth year, they'll have all this experience, then they'll leave. And a really big issue is like the preservation of like this memory, right? Like even from the struggles against the Vietnam War, even from the struggles for, against apartheid, there's so much that's been forgotten that we have to kind of relearn. So I think this is a moment to like put everything together, put all our cards on the table, and see how can we move in a way that escalates, that gets creative, and also if that requires us to take on certain risks or to take on certain responsibilities that we haven't been able to up to this point, then that is like defining the political moment. That's defining the conditions. That means we've gotten to the point where we can now take on these certain risks. And yeah, it's not for me to say specifically what everything is, but I'll end with that.
Just to add on to that, I'll say this. I think that it's pretty clear that right now we're in this moment of repression in our movement, and it's had a really chilling effect. And I think that sometimes there are different parts, there are different ebbs and flows to our movement. And right now we're sort of in this moment where we need to consolidate our wins and then expand on them. I think that there was a time where certain tactics were more viable than maybe they are now. And I don't think that means that things aren't working or that that we can't do certain things that we used to. I think that just means we need to find better and smarter ways in order to do those things. And talking about this like moment of repression, I know especially for the student movement, it's like been really bad. I think that repression is what happens whenever you're winning, right? It's what the universities are a great example of this. Like the universities faced extreme turmoil, and so the response to that was to totally consolidate and close themselves off from any sort of attack that they might face from X administration or Y administration, and really crack down on students and have this like really harsh repression against them. And what that is that's like sort of that's their way of saying that like what you're doing is working. So I think in response to that, it's we have our mass movement as protection. I think that's the first thing, but also I think any sort of pushback against repression is also very powerful, and it requires the actor to then have to recalibrate and figure out what's the next thing that they have to do, because X, Y, and Z isn't working. So I'll say this, and I think some of what we said also earlier about this being a long-term movement is relevant to your question, because I think if we're in this moment of repression and we're trying to consolidate, the reason why is because we want this movement to last past this repression, this moment of repression, right? We want this movement to last past a ceasefire and a Gaza. Like inshallah we get a ceasefire in Gaza soon, and what happens after that is like we need to stay in the struggle long term so that we win Palestinian liberation overall. And I think that's a lesson that we've learned from, I mean, you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned Algeria. Algeria was under French rule for 130 years. South Africa was, I believe, they faced colonial rule for over 300 years, and that was before apartheid, which was about 50 years, if I'm not mistaken. And I just want to put these numbers out there to show that this is something that literally took generations to win. And we can't, and I think that, you know, sometimes whenever we're, I think it's good to look at our strategies and think and assess them and say, okay, what could we be doing better? And I think that that's really important. But sometimes I think it does come from this sort of defeatist mentality where we're thinking nothing is working for the past 2 years, and I think that comes from this like defeatist mentality that is a part of the psychological warfare that Israel is trying to put on the Palestinian people, right? It affects the Palestinian people back home, but it also affects us here into making us not want to stay in this long term, to making us feel like it's hopeless and that everything that we're doing isn't working, when in reality, we need to be doing things like exactly what you were saying, or what you were saying. We need to be creative, and I think, and you know, you talked about direct actions versus the Mask Off First campaign. I think what the Mask Off First campaign did was raise the bar for what we can be doing in this moment. You know, if governments won't give us, if the United States won't give us an arms embargo and we'll stop shipping weapons to Israel, then it's up to us to figure out creative ways to make sure that does happen, and it's through us.
I'll add to the last point you were saying about this feeling of nothing's working. I think part of it is that, the urgency of the genocide, right? That I think that for so many of us, it felt like, and I think given past bombardments of Gaza, I think many of us felt like, okay, this is like, we need to do these like kind of episodic mass mobilizations because we need this to end as soon as possible. And we thought it's gonna be a couple weeks, it's gonna be, okay, it's been a month, okay, it's been 2 months, it's been 3, and I don't think any of us thought that it would last this long. And so I think I think it's not even just, I do think there's some defeatist mentality, but I think it's not even just our mentality that's wrong, it's just that we've been placed in this impossible position of trying to answer the urgency of like, our people are getting martyred in the tens, hundreds, thousands, right? And we need long-term thinking to win, and how do we do that? And we, in part because of our wins, have had to pivot to have needed to pivot to new strategies, because I think this is something we don't talk about often, is that we never had the mass mobilization for Palestine before, and so we set up an entire movement, and rightfully so, we set up an entire movement that was based on, the Palestinian diaspora, anti-Zionist Jewish allies, right? And very little of anyone, and then some leftists, right? And you're right that not all leftists focus on this. It was sort of like, yeah, of course I'm free Palestine, but let's focus on things we can actually talk about, And so I think that for so long our movement was not a mass movement, and then suddenly we could be, because we want the narrative thing. And so then the question becomes, okay, now what could we do now that we have mass public support, right? So I think that's part of that, what inspires this conversation. I'll turn back towards you, Olivia, for a sort of follow-up question, which is that I'm thinking of with your DSA hat on, we are in this moment where we are facing so much, right? There are daily crises, sometimes multiple a day. And we all know in this room, I'm sure, that all of these are interrelated. We're fighting the ruling class. The ruling class is the genocide. The ruling class is ICE. The ruling class is the empire. But how do we fight? How do we make sure that Palestine remains on the table? And how do we make sure that it's not a trade-off that we're willing to sort of make? So I wanted to hear you talk more about that, especially, inspired by what you were reporting back about Portland and progressive Portland.
Yeah, I think we make Palestine a priority priority by also doing all that other work. And having the core organizers in place that know that that's a priority and to always come back to that. I think in general, when we talk about like how to bring people into our movement, the reality is that most people are self-interested. And they might be like, oh yeah, genocide bad, but I'm not gonna do anything about that. We just got done with a massive budget fight at the city level where our DSA counselors were throwing down, and we got some big wins. And we, had a rally and we mobilized the parks workers whose jobs were on the line, and some of the city workers who were gonna lose their jobs. And it's like, okay, everyone's here to rally to save their jobs. Also, here's your Palestine flag, here's your kafia. Like, they know that if they're showing up to these things, they're in coalition with us, and that's what we do. Like, I mean, it's a joke kind of for the right wing in Portland. They're like, oh, I'm so impressed that Olivia could take time out of her busy day trying to destroy the state of Israel to rally for city workers. And I'm like, yeah, thank you. It's a compliment. And I think, that is how we build that movement, is by doing all of these things and always making sure that we're prioritizing Palestine. So when that divestment vote comes up in December, the city workers are gonna know, oh, that's our friends at DSA. They've always shown up for us. We're gonna show up for them. Because, that divestment vote is something that they can have a say in as a city union. I think it's not transactional. It is bringing them into our movement and making them realize that they are a part of our movement.
Can I just say our dream panel, because I didn't have to time you or yell at you or wink at you, and we're right on the schedule that we, so this is amazing. How do I have this all my life? So we really wanted this we know there are many organizers in the room, we know there are many movement folks in the room, so we want to open up the rest of the half an hour to responding to your questions and hearing your comments. I will time y'all though, because it's not my first socialism, and I know how that might be. So if folks want to line up at the mic here, we'll take questions and comments, but I'll ask that folks keep it under 3 minutes. And we'll take like 3 at a time, and then give the panelists the chance to respond, and I'll give myself the right to respond.
Is this the right mic?
It is, in that it works.
Thank you. So my name is Doug. I'm here with Twin Cities DSA, and I'm an organizer with our chapter's Palestine Solidarity Working Group. One thing that we've been dealing with for the past year or so is essentially feeling the wall after the student movement, where you start to lose some of the mass mobilization and attempting to pivot to the long-term stuff of sort of like a BDS nature. And we essentially have a number of things that we are attempting to pull off in the BDS space. And what I'm trying to think through is which campaigns to pick and why, especially with the goal of mostly evangelizing BDS as a movement to folks who we found, other than like leftists, haven't mostly heard of it, even if they might be supportive. And so I'll give some examples of what we're thinking of, and then I'd like to hear like what folks think in terms of like BDS campaigns that are targeted at companies versus governments and et cetera, and what's the best platform to start with. And I'll also say we just don't have a Chevron footprint in our area, or we would be on that one. So we're looking at legislation at sort of the municipal level. Essentially, it sounds like the same thing that y'all are doing in Portland. In December, we're looking at specific contracts at the municipal level, where you essentially talk to folks about an Israeli company that you want the contract canceled for. And then we're looking at no appetite for apartheid campaigns at like local grocery stores and things of that nature. And I guess campaign selection is the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another exemplary timing.
Hey, Carmen.
Eman, don't take this one.
The timer was paused.
Okay, thanks. Hey, comments, Kathleen, Sheeher, Michigan, Ann Arbor. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit. I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan, member of AIT Local 3550, graduate student instructors. And thank you again. And our union has been quite pro-Palestine, passed all sorts of resolutions. We divested our funds. Grad workers have really been a part of the movement for divestment on campus, and in many ways has been able to bring in the mass labor organizing aspect. We ran a referendum on campus after the university canceled a vote, and we ran our own referendum for all workers and students, got 5,000 people to sign up. We talked to thousands of people about divestment. That passed by like 99%. So we know that there's a mass support for divestment on campus. But the main thing I want to talk about is like just the repression. I really think that we did a great job of mass organizing, we did a great job with all sorts of mass actions, but the repression has been so fucking intense. I mean, I don't know, people maybe saw all these flyers around. Like, just to give you a sense, like, our Democratic State Attorney General levied felony and misdemeanor charges against protesters. And I don't want to use the word students. I mean, they're on campus, but this is not just a student movement. We've got workers, we've got community members, and she targeted them. And we've just been in a year-long campaign to defend them. And just last month, we got these charges dropped. Woo! But I would say we were not ready. We did not have infrastructures in place to support people who caught felonies, And that's something that we've learned a lot this past year. And I think sharing those lessons of how to support comrades who have been charged, how do we win against the fucking Attorney General? And by the way, she led FBI raids on our comrades after the charge, so we know there's gonna be more charges. Like, the state is breathing down our fucking neck, as well as the Board of Regents and all of that, who are Democrats. So yeah, I just wanna recognize this, and I'd like to hear from you comrades, what has been successful in creating infrastructures that can sustain. We know we need to be long-term, and we know we've got a state that wants to smash us, just as hard, of course, as we want to smash silencing. So, building those infrastructures, how do we do it? What has been effective? Because we need to be able to win this, and we have to protect our movement, we have to protect each other. Thanks.
Do one more, and then we'll do responses, and then another round.
Hi, thanks. So I'm from St. Louis. We have a municipal campaign for divestment for St. Louis. In particular, we have Boeing, which is a local employer, a major player in the region. We know that they specifically make munitions that have been identified to have been used in Gaza, specifically the GPU-39 bomb, including one that was dropped in Rafah, I think one of the schools that were bombed fairly recently. But also we have Israel Chemical Limited, which is the name, which allegedly makes white phosphorus, and they are currently getting new tax subsidies to build a battery plant, specifically in a historically disinvested neighborhood that just got hit by a tornado. So, as far as where we're at, we have some local officials that I think probably agree with us, in terms of their opinion. Some of them are willing to introduce it. What do you say is sort of the best practices to really get them to take the kinds of risks that are necessary to get these sort of measures through? How do you build on that and make it so that more of the members of local government are following through on those promises?
Thank you so much. Lots of really good questions and difficult questions. Olivia, why don't you start us off? I feel like a lot of these are in your wheelhouse.
Sure. So to the first question about trying to decide on different BDS campaigns, the BDS movement generally recommends 4 target selection criteria, and maybe you're familiar, I see you nodding. Complicity, so the level of complicity, the deeper the complicity, the better target it is. Whether you can build a broad coalition around the target, so that's one of the reasons we chose Chevron as a target, because, there was already this broad campaign from climate organizations, indigenous organizations, so we can build a really big coalition around it. Media appeal, so if you think that there's like a specific media hook to that BDS campaign, and whether it's winnable, and that's arguably the most important, is whether you have a real chance of winning the campaign. And I know that you talked about you wanted to reach people who don't already know about BDS and already know about Palestine, and I love talking about the campaign that we did in Portland, targeting the Portland Trailblazers and their Sniper Show sponsorship, because we were reaching a whole new audience of basketball fans, and we were getting covered in the sports media all the time, which was just a really new and creative way to reach people who we weren't reaching typically in the Palestine movement. So I think just hearing briefly the campaigns that you described, I think it would be interesting probably to explore the contract at the municipal level, just because I think there's probably a way that you could involve city workers, or I don't know, I think there's probably an angle there, more than there is the other 2 that you suggested, but I would love to talk more about that and hash out strategy. I'm going to kick the question about repression on campuses to my comrades over here. And the last question about, how to get the elected officials that you think generally support, get them to take risks. I think you have to get them to see that it's not a risk. They're not taking a risk because you have this mass movement who is going to support them if they do make that decision. And that's, of course, much easier said than done. But I think you have to make them feel like you have their backs when the backlash hits, because it will hit. But it takes a lot of mass movement organizing to be able to make them feel like that. And I think that is, in this climate now, it is possible.
I'll address question 2 specifically. So that's actually a really good question. We speak more broadly about repression, but there are specific tactics and specific things to consider when working around repression. So, the first thing that I'll mention is the idea of partnering with and bolstering in general community defense. So, with the visa revocations, we saw the need to partner with, migrant workers' orgs in order to kind of learn from them and, build those partnerships, because that repression not only was happening to the students at the time, but as we saw, it was also, very quickly happening to migrant communities as well. It's one and the same in that sense. So community defense, that's a very important part of it, and just building out that kind of infrastructure more broadly as well. Another important thing related to that is the concept of coalition building. So both on campus is important, with student groups within your campus, organizing with them, having them as that kind of network of support, but then also across different factions of the university. So you have that united front of staff, faculty, of students, and using that to, when you do face that repression, kind of fight back at all levels, so that the cost of, doing that repression at the university level is understood, and then also coalition building in the community, so that there is that mass outrage when the state also does that repression, and there is that network available in that way. Another important thing is thinking about ways to structure yourself in a way that kind of allows you to maintain yourself through cycling out different important parts of your group, of your organization, of your movement. So we know often leaders, the student leaders of a group, of a SJP, of a movement, whatever you want to say, will be the ones who have the most knowledge and then face the most repression, and then once they're taken out of the equation, it's kind of a thing of crumbling slowly. So that idea of training multiple people, making sure that that education is happening at all levels of your work, so that if you have a certain group, you understand that this repression, you weigh your risks, you weigh your benefits, you understand that this group might face repression. In the case that something happens, you have people who can take that on and continue the work that you're doing. Because unfortunately, that is the place that we're at right now, and unfortunately, that is the way that we have to move. Also, the idea of rapid response networks, right? So, if there is a student who's facing risks of deportation or charges or something like that, having those networks in place locally, learning from previous charges, previous forms of oppression that have been kind of dealt on campus and by the state, by the university, what have you, and using that to think of, okay, how can we make sure that we're responding when this happens? So whether that means building up that kind of legal infrastructure, or having places to keep students who might be at threat, being followed around by ICE, for example. So those are 4 tactics I'll talk about. I spoke about more specifically, but I do also want to mention, obviously these things won't stop repression, they're kind of a response to repression, and we know that repression is the symptom of struggling against this fascist state. But I also do want to mention, in facing this repression, it's really important that we don't let ourselves stall out of fear that if we move, we'll be repressed. Because it is true that if we move unstrategically, if we move too abruptly, we don't think about what we're doing, we can be wiped out. But it is also true that what the state is trying to do is stall us so that it can be more of a death by a million cuts. Because you're not evolving, you're not advancing. And so you're staying in this one place, and you're not actually fulfilling that role of struggling for Palestinian liberation, of challenging the structures at play. So that's something to consider as well, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, thank you all very, very, very much. I would like to ask how you have individually and in your organization practiced criticism and self-criticism. What methods have you used, and what if there has been an example of an individual criticizing you, or this could be written or verbal, within the organization or even between organizations. And I ask because I think it's a very important and difficult skill that if it's not done well, it can decrease the cohesion of the movement, but if it is done well, it can really strengthen it. So that's my question.
Thank you.
My question is, it's clear if we're going to get political power, we need different people in office, right? But in the meantime, if we have these politicians, particularly in these one-party states where either Democrats or Republicans have a stranglehold on political office, and we have these politicians that are bought off by the Israel lobby, what should our relationship to them be? Should we try to bird dog them and publicly humiliate them and But what is your thoughts about expending energy on trying to remove these unmovable politicians, and how that can be a productive strategy? Thanks.
Thank you. Such a good question.
Hi, I'm Joy from Chicago. I think I've been thinking a lot about this kind of disjuncture between the sea change in public opinion and our ability to exercise, to wield power. And I guess the short version of the question is, in each of the domains that you are organizing who are the frontiers, what groups of people are the frontiers of your organizing? Who are the people whose perspectives have been shifted, but haven't yet been organized into movement? And I think in a certain sense, the question is what are the groups of people? Where are the places that we are really actually leaving organized power on the table and could be building in this moment?
Love these questions. What a great set of questions. Okay, let's keep responses rather brief. Who wants to kick us off?
I'll start. Yeah, that last question really made me think about Boeing workers. Boeing workers were on a massive strike in Portland, and they are not the workers that make the bombs or the weapons. They make commercial plane parts, and there was a lot of debate within the left in Portland about how, if and how, we show up for those workers. our DSA's labor working group was on the picket line with those workers, just trying to talk to them and bring them into the movement. But like, we're not in there. We don't have DSA members in the Boeing factory. And I think that is like an open question of how we relate to these workers who, many of them work for companies that are the most complicit in the genocide. And we're very far from organizing them. And yeah, I don't have the answer to that question on how we do that, but that is an area where we're kind of leaving on the table. Like, okay, those Boeing workers in Portland know that DSA showed up for their picket line, and then what? I don't know. I don't know what the follow-up there was. I'm not in our labor working group. So it is something that has been left on the table, and I'm not sure what the next step there is. Let's see, other questions. What's our relationship to politicians who, you know, who are obviously like unmovable? I think bravery creates more bravery. So when we're seeing our DSA electeds, progressive electeds, sticking out their necks for Palestine, it makes it less scary for other politicians who are kind of on the fence to do the same. And we've seen that in action in Portland. I think if politicians want to be seen as progressive, which many of them do, especially in Oregon, whether or not they believe in the cause, they will inch their way that way if they see that that's where the wind is blowing. So we have to make the wind blow that way. And I think it's just like context dependent on whether or not you're burned up in specific politicians, like how movable they actually are on the issue. Self-criticism, I think, yeah, we don't have like a formal self-criticism process in our organization, but we do like analyze what worked, what didn't work. After actions, we debate a lot of things, and I guess like informally criticize each other that way. We don't have like a formal self-criticism process.
I just wanted to like speak to the last question because I agree with what you're saying. I think that something that we have to think about is the amount of workers, especially who are working in these specific industries, and we haven't gotten to a point where people can just block railroads or stop shipments by their own volition for weapons companies. And but I think that the point of expanding our movement and making it bigger is really honing in that everyone does have a role to play inside of our movement, and making sure that our campaigns and the work that we're doing has some sort of point of entry for these different people or workers or who aren't necessarily organized. And I think that I just want to speak on the Worst campaign a little bit because I think it's a good example of that. Like having some sort of point of entry. Like maybe we're not going to workers with asks to do X, Y, and Z action because that's not something that they can do in this moment. But we're building those relationships so that if there are workers who have insider information that could help us in our research and further the campaign, that's something that's available to them, and that's a part that they can play in this movement, and it's an important part that they can play in this movement, right? And I think that that's a good example of sort of like having a point of entry, so that everyone does have that role to play. And I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I'll touch like really briefly on question 1 regarding crit self-crit. I think an important thing coming out of crit self-crit is that once a criticism is issued, you have to have a very concrete plan on how you're gonna follow up on that criticism. I think sometimes you can enter like crit self-crit hell, where it's just like the same criticisms are gonna come up if there aren't next steps taken. So I would just say like having that follow-up is incredibly important.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Valerie. I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm with the BDS Pittsburgh Coalition as a part of the HowMet Accountability Project. Still really not comfortable talking in front of this many people, but I feel like this is an important campaign that I really want to let more people, kind of get more people into the fold on this. Howmet, that's Howmet, is a lesser known aerospace engineering company that makes these specialty titanium aerospace parts and sells them to Lockheed Martin to build the F-35 jets currently responsible for dropping bombs on Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. And obviously when we think about Lockheed Martin, that's such a massive company that almost feels insurmountable. But what we think is targetable about Howmet is that this is they're an otherwise civilian corporation, and only 15% of their business comes from making the parts for the F-35 jet. That being said, since the beginning of the genocide, their profits their revenue has risen 19%, and their stock market price has quadrupled in value. So they are blatantly profiting off of this genocide, meanwhile sponsoring things like Pride, Pittsburgh Pride. They had a float at our Pittsburgh Pride Parade. They like to give grants to local nonprofits. They are like the king of whitewashing, pinkwashing in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where they're headquartered. That being said, they are an international company, and after 2 years of trying to tackle them locally through petitions, letters, protests, rallies, media coverage, they've of course not budged. So after hitting this wall, we are now moving forward with what we would like to be a nationwide campaign. They have locations in Tucson, Arizona, LA, San Francisco, New Haven, Savannah, Georgia, Minneapolis, Dover, New Jersey, Rochester, New York, Akron, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, Del Rio, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Houston, Texas, Waco, Texas, and Norfolk, Virginia. So if anyone in this room is from any of those places, please contact me afterwards, because we are in the process of contacting pro-Palestine groups and organizations in those areas to move forward with a day of action, hopefully nationwide. We're thinking sometime in the fall, but it's very much in the planning stages. And so any input, especially from Olivia, who I saw at the BDS meeting earlier today, would be fantastic. And again, anyone who might be interested in joining this campaign, please come up to me after, or you can check us out on BDS Pittsburgh on Instagram and shoot us a message there.
You should have been more public speaking, Valerie. You did great. You could. Yes, absolutely.
I'm also from Pittsburgh, so I love you, BDS Pittsburgh. Yay! It's just a coincidence. But my question is specifically for Olivia, because I was a very active DSA member from 2017 to I think 2021 to 2022, but ultimately I quit because even though I knew that my local DSA chapter was committed to the Palestinian liberation, I was very disillusioned after the treatment of the National BDS Working Group. And so I focused my Palestine organizing within my own union and within my own reproductive justice work, because I felt like I could do more good there. So as someone who was disillusioned and quit, and acknowledging that it has been 3 to 4 years since I quit, and you didn't quit, and you're still committed, I'm curious why I should rejoin DSA in your perspective, considering my disillusionment and why.
I appreciate that.
I thought I was going to have the hottest one for the end. Hey, Gumbo Zeta, I'm one of the co-chairs of Austin DSA, and I think how to phrase this. I was thinking about what Comrade Nashwa said about intervening in the media narrative, and if my red triangle shirt is any indication, I have not hidden from vocal support for the resistance and the axis of resistance more broadly, but I know it's a difficult thing to do in the U.S., and I know especially the PYM and PSC comrades in Austin try not to talk too much about specific factions in Palestine, and I think for good reason. but I'm curious how we continue to intervene in the media narrative to make it clear that most of the wins in Gaza and across the region have been because of resistance, armed struggle in the face of colonialism, and not shying away from that fact, because I think the Palestine movement in the US has generally leaned away from acknowledging armed struggle as a legitimate legal right, and I worry that we undermine some of our own movement and some of the legitimate movement of the people there by doing so. So just, I guess, how we intervene there.
We're at time, so I'm going to ask us to keep it pretty brief in our responses, and of course, if folks need to head out, we respect your time and will not be offended. We'll cry a little.
I'll keep it brief. I think that a lot of what you say has is really important, because I really do think it's a critical role of ours to raise consciousness, especially on resistance and especially the narrative around resistance for Palestinians. I think that what you're talking about is like a really hard legal question that we're dealing with in this country, right? What I will say is that I think that what supporting Palestinians, the general Palestinian right to resist means, though, especially here in this country, is more about, it's less about being the loudest person saying that, like, I support X faction, I support Y faction, and I support X action and Y action, and more about, like, how are we supporting Palestinian resistance in order so that they can get the best deals for the ceasefire agreement, for example, and what are we doing in this country that is that is essentially making it so that our people back home, all our people, are able to have the best conditions now and post ceasefire, and I think that that's kind of the way that I do that. I cut it short.
Yeah, just building on that, our job is to get the boot off their neck. That's our number one task in the United States. I think just responding to the comrade's question about quitting DSA, about the BDS working group, I founded that working group. I've written a convention resolution on BDS in Palestine, every single convention since the first resolution that endorsed BDS in 2017. So I was also very disheartened about what went down between the national organization and the BDS working group, but I chose to stay in DSA because I still believe that DSA is the place to organize for Palestine, because of all the other reasons I have already listed, and also because of the work that my chapter was doing. The national leadership is re-elected every 2 years, and the great thing about DSA is it's a big tent organization, so we are, we vary kind of widely in terms of like where we fall ideologically under the socialist umbrella. And if you don't like something that DSA is doing, you can change it. It's a democratic organization. We have a ton of convention resolutions coming up this year. So just because, something happens that, leadership decided on or something didn't go your way, it doesn't mean it's a permanent fixture of DSA. It's a democratic organization. Things are always changing. And ultimately, it's up to the members what the organization does. So that's why I stay. And, I was just so happy to hear about the helmet thing again, and I know we haven't connected yet since this morning, but also excited to hear that piece about, like, the sponsorships, because I think that is very much, like, a good step for your organization to take in, like, next steps of campaigns, is targeting those sponsorships in the community, and we can talk about that later.
Sahar, did you have anything you want to add? Okay, I just want to note, as we close, that it is incredible to me how many folks came up and said these are the material things we're doing in our local context for Palestine. All this, when we say that Palestine liberates us, right, we understand these bad actors in our community so much better now because of Palestine, and I'm so glad to be fighting them alongside of you. I want to say Allahumma arham amwatana wal majdu shuhada'na, and free Palestine. See you on the street.